In the United States and around the world, the situation is terribly frightening. The drug pandemic is destroying the bodies, minds, and souls of youth in every part of the world. Entire nations are being destroyed by drug-financed international terrorism. During the middle of the 1970s, there was the worst genocide of the century in Cambodia. But now, famine and disease are wiping whole African nations from the map. Here in the United States, our farms are being driven into bankruptcy, while the world as a whole is plunged into the worst food crisis of the century. Our industries are collapsing, while 40 million Americans are below the poverty line. And a majority of our debt-ridden people are much less well off than their families were 20 years ago. We are now at the brink of the worst worldwide financial crisis collapse in modern times. Possibly the deepest depression in our history could hit us during the coming 2 years. Some who say that they will set the policies of the next administration are proposing to let the International Monetary Fund increase your taxes, dictate our federal, state, and local budgets, reduce the incomes of our people, and forbid new investments in agriculture and industry. According to powerful circles in Western Europe, Europe will go under the dictatorship of a Europe-wide super-government after the European parliamentary elections of 1992. There are those, even in the United States, who propose handing West Germany's economy to Moscow, an act which would reduce the United States to a third-rate power. Leading members of the European establishment are saying to my associates there that these developments are a sign that an entire era of modern history is coming to an end. If those governments and the next president here make the kinds of decisions towards which Democratic Party leader Robert Strauss and others have referred, the next 2 years will be the worst crisis in our nation's history. Partly because of those decisions, the world as we have known it will come to an end by the time the 1990s begins. I'm not a pessimist. I'm a realist. I have the courage to look these dangers square in the eye because I know there are solutions. We can conquer these dangers and save our freedom if we can find statesmen with the courage to make the bold decisions needed to reverse the downward trends we've been following during the past 20 years. Naturally, when those establishment figures say that we have come to the end of an era, they mean the post-war era. They mean the end of what used to be called the American century. They also mean something more than just the end of the American century. They mean this planet sliding into a new dark age like that in 14th century Europe. They mean the end of everything civilization has achieved in the cause of human freedom in Europe and the United States since the famous Council of Florence set modern civilization into motion back in 1439. I bring you terrible facts, but I also bring you a message of hope. Think back to the end of the last war. Back then, more than 60% of our labor force was employed on farms or as industrial operatives or in building up our infrastructure. 60% of our labor force was employed directly in production of useful physical wealth. Today, less than 20% of our labor force is producing physical wealth. More than 80% of our people are either unemployed, working in administration, sales, or low-paid, low-skilled services. Since 1977, nearly all of the increased number of jobs have been in low-paid service work. The mature citizen you see working behind the counter selling hamburgers or pizza at very low wages used to be a skilled worker whose income supported a family, paid for a decent home, and sent children to college. All our wealth comes from the labor of people who are employed either as farmers who produce your food, industrial operatives who produce the goods you use, or build and maintain the essential economic infrastructure upon which the health of private investment depends. The rest of the work we do is an overhead expense added to the cost of everything you eat, wear, and so on. Every person who is producing physical wealth today must carry the overhead burden of 4 people on his back, in addition to the terrible inflationary effect of that excessive overhead burden. Everything we produce is being taxed to the limit by a spiral of financing charges. We can change this picture. My objective is to build up our industry, farms, and infrastructure with new technologies which increase our average incomes by 50% before the end of this century. Our objectives for the year 2000 should include 40% of the national labor force employed in skilled industrial jobs, and 10% of the labor force employed in research and development, creating the new technologies we need. When you watch most of our leading politicians discussing foreign policy today, you ought to be reminded of little girls about 6 or 7 playing with dolls. When the so-called experts discuss what is going on in Moscow, they talk like scriptwriters for a TV soap opera. One of the troubles with our policy is that most of our so-called political experts are living in a fantasy world. These people talk as though Mikhail Gorbachev were our man in Moscow. What they have told you about the recent purge in Moscow was absolute nonsense. Let's take that as an example of what is wrong with U.S. foreign policy. Back in the spring, Moscow told the world that the next shakeup would come at a so-called plenary session scheduled for October. Then, this September, Moscow said that the October meeting was postponed until next January. On Monday, September 26th, right after his meeting with Vice President George Bush, Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze said so again. Then, 2 days later, on Wednesday, Moscow announced that an extraordinary session would be held on Friday. What happened to change Moscow's mind? First, Soviet Defense Minister Yazov had flown to India from a key Soviet military command center near Romania. An extraordinary military exercise had been run under his direction, with no Western observers allowed. At the same time, there was a special meeting of the Soviet bloc defense ministers. The following Wednesday, the Soviet Union went on a major full-scale military alert. That same day, Gorbachev announced the extraordinary meeting for that Friday. What happened at that weekend shake-up in Moscow? The short answer is that the Soviet military and KGB moved in to grab more power than they've had since Stalin's time. All of the key promotions during that weekend were given to members of one very tight group. All of those promoted have been top associates of former KGB chief Yuri Andropov and Marshal Nikolai Argakov since as early in some cases as the Leningrad Front during World War II. Take a look at the shakeup in Moscow that weekend.
Viktor Mikhailovich Chebrikov, age 65, nationality Russian. Came to the KGB in 1967 with Yuri Andropov, chairman of the KGB since December 1982, 1 month after Andropov's elevation to Communist Party General Secretary. Promoted September 30th, 1988, to head the new Commission on Questions of Legal Policy, in charge of the KGB, Soviet military, internal police, and the judiciary. Vadim Andreevich Medvedev, age 59, nationality Russian. Appointed chief of the Science and Education Department of the Central Committee in 1983 by Yuri Andropov. Promoted September 30th to chief of the Central Committee's Ideological Commission. Vladimir Alexandrovich Kryuchkov, age 64, nationality Russian. 3-star general in the KGB. Worked with Yuri Andropov in Hungary in 1956 and at the Central Committee during the 1960s. Came to the KGB in 1967 with Andropov. Rose to the chief of KGB intelligence. Promoted October 1st to chairman of the KGB. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, age 57, nationality Russian. Designated Crown Prince by former KGB chief Yuri Andropov in 1982. General Secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee since March 1985. Promoted October 1st to chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, the Soviet head of state.
Contrary to most Western commentary, the extraordinary plenary sessions were not a personal victory for Michael Gorbachev. It was a victory for the Andropov-Argakov kindergarten, of which Gorbachev is just one member. This Andropov-Argakov kindergarten is the political machine which has taken over the Soviet military and KGB machines. which both increased their grip on the Soviet imperial power during that extraordinary weekend. This is not the last such political coup in Moscow. There will be more to come soon enough. Individual members of this clique may be promoted or demoted in the coming shakeups. But whatever happens to the individual personalities, the Andropov-Orgakov machine is rapidly tightening its grip on the Soviets to a degree not seen since the days of Joseph Stalin. In one sense, there were no surprises in these promotions. A consistent power grab by the members of the Andropov-Orgakov kindergarten was what I predicted during the weeks just before Gorbachev was made General Secretary back during early 1985. The only significant thing about that shakeup was the timing. What was so special about the Warsaw Pact Defense Ministers' meeting to cause the Moscow plenary sessions to be called so suddenly? What possible Soviet military actions are coming up so fast that shakeup had to be pushed through at that time rather than waiting for next January? Everything was set up to go for a joint Soviet, Hungarian, and Bulgarian thrust into Romania. I checked my best sources in Western Europe. The Socialist International and part of the British establishment press, among others, were joining with Hungary's government in demanding the scalp of Romania's Ceausescu. Would the tanks roll into Romania? Everything was set to go. The Warsaw Pact was ready to move, and the lefties in the West were already cheering for Moscow's overthrow of the Romanian regime. Why Romania? Here's the key to a Soviet military occupation of Romania. The key is crisis-torn Yugoslavia. Moscow intends to use that crisis to bring about a partition of Yugoslavia. The Serbians, the Montenegrins, and the Macedonians are supposed to come under Moscow's military protection, and Croatia and Slovenia are to drift toward the west. If Moscow assumes the role of protector of the Serb-led portion of divided Yugoslavia during the next coming months, what is the situation in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean as a whole? Right after the last elections in Greece, Andreas Papandreou entered into a military pact with a number of members of the Soviet military alliance, Bulgaria and Syria, against Turkey, and has been pushing the United States and NATO out of the Eastern Mediterranean ever since. Papandreou may not think he's a Soviet puppet, but the Soviets are rapidly gaining such control inside and around Greece that Greece is becoming rapidly a Soviet asset in all but name. So if Moscow establishes a protectorate over part of a divided Yugoslavia, its grip on Greece is strengthened. Turkey's flanks are exposed. Moscow is closer than ever to realizing its centuries-long ambition of grabbing Istanbul. Meanwhile, down in Egypt, blundering U.S. foreign policy is creating the conditions for a Muslim Brotherhood takeover in that country. The epidemic of Sunni Muslim fundamentalism is spreading throughout the Middle East and North Africa, and into non-Arab nations too. In this case, Israel's strategic situation becomes nearly hopeless, and the Eastern Mediterranean is up for grabs by Moscow whenever it chooses. Nonetheless, some idiots in Israel, as well as Britain and the United States, continue Zbigniew Brzezinski's deluded dream that another round of Islamic fundamentalism is a card the West can play. Come with me to Berlin, where I delivered a major press conference on the morning of Wednesday, October the 12th. Under the proper conditions, many today will agree that the time has come for early steps toward the reunification of Germany, with the obvious prospect that Berlin might resume its role as the nation's capital. For the United States, as for Germans and Europe generally, the question is, will this reunification process be brought about by assimilating the Federal Republic into the East Bloc's economy or economic range of influence? Or can it be accomplished in a different way? In other words, is a united Germany to come into being as a part of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, as President de Gaulle proposed, or as Mr. Gorbachev has desired, a Europe from the Urals to the Atlantic? I see the possibility that the process of unification could occur precisely as de Gaulle proposed. I base this possibility on the reality of a terrible worldwide food crisis which has erupted during the past several months and which will dominate the world's politics in every part of the world for at least 2 years to come. The economy of the Soviet bloc itself is a terrible and worsening failure. In Western European culture, we have demonstrated that the successes of nations of big industries depends upon the technologically progressive independent farmer and what is called here in Germany the Mittelstand. Soviet culture in its present form is not capable of applying this lesson. Despite all attempts at structural reform, and despite any amount of credit supplied by the foolish West, the Soviet bloc economy as a whole has reached the critical point. At its present time, in its present form, it will continue to slide downhill from here on, even if the present worldwide food crisis had not come into being. I do not foresee the possibility of genuine peace between the United States and Soviet Union earlier than 30 to 40 years from now. The best we can do in the meantime, in the name of peace, is to avoid a new general war among the major powers. This war avoidance must be based partly upon armed strength and our political will. It must be based also on rebuilding the strength of our economies. At the same time that we discourage Moscow from dangerous military and similar adventures, we must heed the lesson taught to us by a great military scientist from about 400 years ago, Niccolo Machiavelli. We must always provide our adversary with a safe route of escape. We must rebuild our economies to the level at which we can provide the nations of the Soviet bloc an escape from the terrible and worsening effects of their economic suffering. During 1988, the world will have produced between 1.4 and 1.7 billion tons of food, grains, and that is already a disastrous world shortage of grain. To ensure conditions of political and strategic stability during 1989 and 1990, we shall require between 2.4 and 2.5 billion tons of grain worldwide approximately. At those levels, we will be able to meet minimal Soviet requirements. Without something approaching that level, we could not. If the nations of the West would adopt an emergency agricultural policy, those nations working together could ensure that we reach the level of food supply corresponding to about 2.4 billion tons of grain. It would be a major effort. It would mean scrapping the present agricultural policies of many governments and supranational institutions, but it could be accomplished. If we are serious about avoiding the dangers of war during the coming 2 years, we will do just that. I shall propose the following concrete perspectives to our next government. We say to Moscow, we will help you. We shall act to establish food for peace agreements among the international community, with the included goal that neither the people of the Soviet Union nor the developing nations shall go hungry. In response to our good faith in doing that for you, let us do something which will set an example of what can be done to help solve the economic crisis throughout the Soviet bloc generally. Let us say that the United States and Western Europe will cooperate to accomplish the successful rebuilding of the economy of Poland, a kind of Marshall Plan aid to rebuild Poland's industry and agriculture. If Germany agrees to this, let a process aimed at the reunification of Germany economies begin. And let this process leading toward reunification be the punctum saliens for Western cooperation in assisting the rebuilding of the economy of Poland. We in the United States and Germany should say to the Soviet bloc, let us show you what we can do for the peoples of Eastern Europe. By this test in Poland, which costs you really nothing, let you discover and judge by the results whether this is a lesson you wish to try in other cases. All of us who are members of that mysterious stratum called world-class politicians know that the world has now entered what most agree is the end of the post-war era. The state of the world as we've known it during the post-war period is coming rapidly to an end. The only question is whether the new era will be better or worse than the era we are leaving. The next 2 years, especially, will be the most dangerous period in modern European history, and that worldwide. Already in Africa, entire nations, such as Uganda, are in the process of vanishing from the political map biologically. Madness on a mass scale, of a sort which Central Europe has not known since the new dark age of the 14th century, has already destroyed Cambodia and is threatening to take over the Middle East as a whole, and is on the march to one degree or another in every part of this world. As a result of these conditions of crisis, the world has never been closer to a new world war than under the conditions which threaten us during the next 4 years. What governments do during the coming 2 years will decide the fate of all humanity for a century or more to come. There have been similar, if not identical, periods in the crises of history before this time. But never, to our best knowledge, has such a crisis occurred on a global scale all at once. If we as a civilization are to survive, we must make boldly imaginative decisions on the condition that they are good choices as well as bold ones. The time has come for a bold decision on U.S. policy towards Central Europe. We may be certain that the content of my statement here will be examined at the highest levels in Moscow before many hours have passed. The Soviet leadership has said in its newspapers and elsewhere repeatedly that it considers me as its leading adversary among individual public figures today. Nonetheless, Moscow also regards me with a curious sort of fascination. And since President Reagan first announced the SDI, Moscow considers everything I say on policy matters to be influential and very credible. Moscow will wait, after reading this statement in its version, to see which other circles around the U.S. establishment echo the kind of proposals I've identified. Once they see a confirming signal from those quarters, Moscow will treat the proposal which I've made in the statement today very seriously, and will begin exploring U.S. and European thinking on this subject. So I've come to Berlin, where the delivery of this report will have the maximum impact in Moscow as well as in other places. For reasons you can readily recognize from the evidence you see before you, I know my German friends and acquaintances rather well, and share the passions of those who think of Germany with loving memory of Leibniz, Lessing, Beethoven, Humboldt, Schiller, and the great statesman of freedom, Freiherr von Stein. I cannot predict Germany's decisions in this matter of which I've spoken today. I believe that what I have set afoot, if it's brought to success, will have the included result that a Reichstag building restored to its original condition will be the seat of Germany's future parliament, and the beautiful Charlottenburger Schloss, the future seat of the German government. If the conditions arise in which that occurs, President de Gaulle's dream of a Europe from Atlantic to the Urals will be the peaceful outcome of 30 years of patient statecraft for the years ahead. And that durable peace will come to Europe and the world within the lifetime of those graduating from universities today. And therefore, heute, ich bin auch ein Berliner. Heute, ich bin auch ein Berliner.
Am I speaking to Dr. Gomez?
Yes, John. I have the announcement you've been waiting for. As of 5 minutes ago, our environmental systems have been fully stabilized. Man's first permanent colony on Mars is now fully operational.